And even more exciting, I want to introduce my good friend, Dr. David Hanauer, who is here to give the keynote lecture. I've known David for a long time. And whenever I mention to someone about knowing Dr. Hanauer, I always say he's the most brilliant person I know. He's smarter than anyone, and the greatest scholar we have at IUP. He just is so fantastic. I won't read his resume because that would take us the rest of the day. But he has tons of books. He's had multi-million-dollar grants. He has a $1 million Howard Hughes grant that he's worked on for many years. Lots of other grants. Actually more grant work that he can keep up with. Tons of publications. Probably his most interesting publication was in the journal Science, which never publishes English people, but Dr. Hanauer was able to publish there. And has actually done a lot of research about how to encourage people to become scientists, so that's really fabulous. But what I love best about his work is his poetry, his research work. That's really been seminal. And David is a great poet as well as a great researcher and scholar and a fabulous teacher. I'll give one plug, so I have to observe everyone who teaches in the language, literature, and writing department. So I observed one time David's online class, and David had not been teaching online until COVID started and he had to do. I observed his class. I said, "This is the best online class I have ever seen." He really figured out how to do it. So much work, all these videos, and structured really with a flipped classroom kind of design that you learn everything outside of class and come into class and do the work. But just a brilliant way to do it, the way distance ed should be done. We have wonderful teachers in the English department, but that was really just, so pleased to see that. So that's a real testament. But also, he's just a great human being, a great friend, and every time I meet with him, I'm energized just by hearing all his ideas and talking. So that's enough for me, but I just want to welcome him and say you're in for a treat. I'm so glad he's here in person, but also connecting to our live Zoom audience. So welcome, Dr. Hanauer.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, so first off, let me just say a few things about being invited to come here, what I'm going to talk about. So first of all, I'd like to thank Rachel and Josh and anybody else who was involved in this decision. I don't leave my house very much, to be honest. I definitely don't go to conferences to give presentations. But I decided, and I could have done this online, as I do most things, but it's the nature of the topic itself and some of the things I'm involved with that I wanted to come in person to do it with you. I know there's lots of people online, and I fully understand being online. It gives a bit of reach. But it was important to me to physically be here. Now, let me say a word about that, and then I'll talk about the lecture itself. So there is something about the presence of body in space which is meaningful. So it was quite emotional for me to come to IUP. I've been here, I've worked here forever, but I haven't actually been here physically for a very long time, several years in fact. And it was quite an experience for me to walk into IUP, to drive into it. I have very positive feelings about IUP. It's not negative. We're not talking about, feeling bad about it. It's very positive, and I'm very happy to be here. And I am honestly very happy to be here at this session. I looked over the presentations before I came, those of yesterday and those of today, and it's honestly really gratifying to see the type of work that's being done. These are dark days for the humanities. There's a lot of attacks on knowledge, science, and humanities and social science. And it's really, really gratifying to see such deep work coming out of the two programs in our department. And you should all be, anybody who's presenting and anyone's in the program should be proud of themselves. Okay. So the title of this lecture is Interdisciplinarity and the Psychology of the Linguistic Landscape. I'm pretty sure this doesn't mean much to most people sitting here. I don't mean the psychology bit or the interdisciplinarity bit, I mean the linguistic landscape bit. And my aim broadly is to introduce you to what linguistic landscape research looks like, what it deals with, some of the ideas which underpin it, some of the bodies of knowledge which underpin it. So if you think of it that way, it's sort of like an introduction to a field. I won't be dealing very much with methodology because that would take too long and wouldn't be really relevant, I think, to most of you. I also won't be dealing with in-depth case studies because, once again, I don't think you're here to hear me go off on a very particular line of research. So it's broader than that. I do want to say something about interdisciplinarity. Anybody who knows me, anybody who knows my work, knows that I have a deep, deep irreverence for disciplines. At different periods in my life, have worked in microbiology labs, I've published in science, I've worked as a poet. This stuff sounds very disparate, and you might be thinking to yourself, it's probably all very shallow, and you might be right. Perhaps it is all very shallow. I have deep respect for people who focus on this. But what I'd like to say before we start this lecture is, I'd like to encourage all of you to think about what you know and how it can work beyond the areas that you usually work in. Don't be scared. Don't be scared to go into a different field and use the knowledge that you have acquired and see what happens. You want to know how I published 75 papers? Well, the easy part of it was I just took knowledge from one field, went into another field who'd never heard of any of this stuff and just did it. It's the easiest thing in the world. You want to publish a lot of papers? That's all you've got to do. But I'd like to go beyond that and say something that's, I think, particularly important at this period of time, which is I don't think universities, disciplines, scholars, people who have knowledge can stay only within the university. I think this is a time in which we need to share our knowledge and make our knowledge present in all sorts of different ways, mainly because there is such an attack on knowledge. I'm not talking about the arguments of truth and untruth and so on. We can talk about that. What I'm talking about is just there are experts in the world who know stuff, and then there are idiots who have opinions. And those two are not the same. And this idea that you can take an idiot and he's got a theory, and you can take an expert and he's got or she's got a theory, and they are equal, we need to give them shared space, is a ridiculous argument, which does not make any sense. Okay, that's enough about this interdisciplinarity. I have one extra word to say about this lecture, interdisciplinarity. As I'll say shortly, the linguistic landscape is a very interdisciplinary space. And you'll see why very shortly. And I will summarize briefly some bodies of knowledge which play into that. But the lecture itself, and I as a human being, I always bring in what I'm currently interested in. And my current interests are going to sound strange. I admit it up front, but my current interests are very much with very early ancient theology. And I'm going to talk about it. And you might be, I'm no expert. I don't claim to be a biblical expert, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit to make a very particular point, which basically summarizes my lecture. So I'm going to take you all the way back to about the 13th century before Christ. So that's a long time ago. And I'm also going to take you quite a long way away. I'm going to take you to the Transjordan area. And I want to talk very briefly about a group of people. We don't know very much about this group. We know from their name that they were wanderers or nomadic people. They're people from the land of Shasu, which was later part of the peoples of Canaan, we think. We know about them because of an early inscription from an Egyptian hieroglyph. But this is what I want to tell you about these people. The first mention of the god Yahweh, which later became the Israelite God, although there's an argument whether this is the same God, but we won't go there, is with this group of people. Now, the god Yahweh, I know all of you, I can see it in your minds. All of you are thinking, what is he talking about? And why are we talking about this in relation to the linguistic landscape? I promise you it will become clear. And anybody who's had a class with me knows that I digress often. And it seems like a rant, but I do have a point. Eventually, I will get there. So this group of people who were wanderers, who had a god called Yahweh, the god Yahweh was a thunder god. He was a rain god. So a very different definition of Yahweh that we find later on. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. If anybody knows the Transjordan area, this is desert, and when it rains, if it rains, there are flash floods. And when you have a flash flood, people die. It's true to this day. To this day, you have people who die in flash floods in this area. Now, I want you to think about for a second, put yourselves in the place of this nomadic people, Semitic speaking, but nomadic people. Why would they have a thunder god, a rain god? What is the purpose of having a thunder god or a rain god? Now, I think the answer is pretty obvious, right? So if you are in a situation of chaos, of fear, of being subject to the weather, you would like to have a little bit of control. So how do we do that? Well, we say there's an intent behind the thunder. There's an intent behind the rain. The minute you say there's an intent behind the rain, you're saying there's a consciousness, a being behind the rain. The minute there's a being behind the rain, there's somebody I can talk to. There's somebody I can do. I can sacrifice things. I can pray, perhaps. There's things I can do. Now, that's about nomadic people and God. But now I want to talk about the linguistic landscape. What did these people do? What they really did is they had a response to their environment, and then they rewrote the environment. When you have a God, when you have an intent, when you have a being, suddenly thunder is not chaos. Thunder is a sign. Rain is a sign. Thunder and rain are things I can do. It means I have to do things. Perhaps I need to be better at something. Perhaps I need to sacrifice something. Perhaps I need to pray more. Perhaps I need to do something. Suddenly, the environment is semiotic. It's a sign. It's a system of signs. And I am writing the signs. I am creating, even if I don't know it, I'm creating those signs. And at the same time, I'm reading them and I'm responding to them. That is the linguistic landscape. Without language, in the example I gave, and I chose that example on purpose, apart from the fact that I'm really interested in this stuff at the moment. And as I said, when I'm interested in stuff, it just appears. I don't differentiate my life from my academic work or what I say. But I want you to think about this situation, that you are in a place, you respond to the environment. Physically, you respond to the things that are coming at you. And then you try to rewrite that in some way. How you dress, the walls we have around us, this screen, this microphone, this chair, everything is part of the environment and you are responding to it, including my voice and what I'm wearing and so on and so forth. So that's my introduction to the linguistic landscape. Now I'm going to be a bit more technical about it and a bit more, I would say, academic. Let's put it that way. So first off, I just want to say the nature of linguistic landscape cannot be dealt with one discipline. It's just not a possibility. I think there have been attempts, and I'll take you through a bit of the history of this, of how this developed. But if you really want to address the linguistic landscape, you're going to need an interdisciplinary framework. I wrote just a few down here, and I'm going to go through them, unfortunately for you, perhaps, but a bit of literary theory, a bit of philosophy, a bit of cognitive psychology, a bit of neuroscience, and a bit of critical discourse analysis. There are other areas that we could talk about. I once did a presentation at a geography conference, and I found that there's this whole field of psychological geography, which is very close to linguistic landscape. Who knew? And so there are other areas. But I think you get the idea that if you want to explore the linguistic landscape, you're going to have to sort of have a picture of these different types of knowledge. So let me be very academic and tell you about the history of the field. So in 1997, Langer and Morris gave a very particular definition of the linguistic landscape. Linguistic landscape refers to the visibility and salience of languages on public and commercial signs in a given territory and region. Very applied linguistic material. Explicit language on signs. If you want to know how you negotiate an airport, that's the linguistic landscape, and people from linguistic landscape research earned hundreds of thousands of dollars designing those really pretty pathetic pathways through an airport. Mainly designed to keep you out of areas rather than to get to areas. Slightly later definitions, and this is probably the most well-known definition of the linguistic landscape. Linguistic landscape studies examine the way languages are visually displayed in public spaces, providing insights into the socio-linguistic reality of a given area. I can explain the last election using linguistic landscape. People saw signs in a different language and they freaked out about it. They got scared about it. Suddenly the areas they know and feel so comfortable in don't look like the areas they were in. And they responded emotionally and then voted. I think it's a very simple explanation of how we respond to the realities in the world around us, in our environment, without even knowing that those are the realities we're responding to, which I'll tell you about very shortly. Let me give you a quick, very, very quick, just history of how this field developed. These are all pictures I took, by the way, so in one way or another. So at the top, you have the analysis of linguistic signage. This is Paris, by the way. You know? Then you have that moved into a sort of semiotic analysis of space. This is a tea house in Pittsburgh called Dobra. I highly recommend it. If you're ever in Pittsburgh, you should go. But it has these different areas which represent different places which tea comes from. And the last one, so it moved from explicit language to semiotic signs, which I'll speak about shortly. And then it moved from semiotic signs into a very broad discursive semiotic, sociological and psychological analysis of space. And I'm going to take you there as well. And this is a sign from the University of Aachen, which is on the border between Germany and Holland. And this is from a Free Palestine demonstration. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to very quickly, and I apologize for the simplicity of what I'm about to say, but I just want to give you a picture of the different bodies of knowledge which come into play here. So I'm just going to give you a quick review of different types of knowledge. And an important one is semiotics. I'm sure everybody in the room here knows something about semiotics, or perhaps an awful lot about semiotics. I'm still going to go over it because it's relevant to what I want to say later on. So a sign is something that communicates a meaning beyond itself. My tie is a sign, my mask is a sign, my body is a sign, and so on. Then you have signified and signifier. So the signified is the thing, and the signifier is what it means. This is the two important pieces. Every sign has a denotation and a connotation. I love it when people tell us what Trump said. It's like poetic analysis. He says something very clear, and then somebody tells me, no, he means something completely opposite. No, he doesn't. I think we can stick with denotation and we're going to be fine. We do not need connotation and we do not need literary interpretation. And finally, within the semiotics field, the later part of the semiotics field, I should say, we know that all codes function within a cultural context. So you cannot think of a code and what it means without thinking about the cultural context within which that appears. Okay, now I want to talk about discourse, or one aspect of discourse. So we know that discourse conveys meaning, but it also constructs identities, and more importantly, it constructs social realities. I think this is something very well known to everybody in the audience today. There's a reason why the current government wants to get rid of certain words. You know that in research, you're not allowed now to use certain words. I was told that I cannot collect demographic data, to which I said, well, I won't tell you what I said, but I intend to collect demographic data. They might cancel my grant, sorry. But I still intend to collect demographic data because I think this is stupid, basically, is what I think. I think it's ridiculous. But I understand why they want to do it, because the idea is if you whitewash discourse, then people won't think these words, which of course is stupid in itself, but I understand what they're trying to do. But more importantly, for what I want to say about the linguistic landscape is that discourse has a history. All discourse has a history. One of the reasons I'm so interested in early theology is I just love this idea of a genealogy of meaning for the most fundamental things that make up being human. And I love this idea of how ideas and words and meanings change over a period of time. And when I listen to people, sometimes I think to myself, wow, you know, they're using it in this context, in this meaning, but there's this long history which just lives within these terms, which these people might not be aware of. Anybody who knows Foucault's work knows exactly what I'm talking about. We live in this plane of time. We have no choice, right? We live in the plane of time. But underneath it is this enormous, vast human culture. And that's what I love about the humanities. People often associate my work with the sciences, but I love the humanities. And I see no contradiction in loving both, actually. But I love this idea of this history which feeds into discourse and just lives there, even though we don't necessarily know it when we speak. I also love phenomenology. If you know my work on poetic autoethnography, and you had a session yesterday, so you should, if you were here, you should know something about it. We experience things. We are not black boxes, blank, transparent slates. We live and experience things. And it's always important to remember that we are things. I particularly like Merleau-Ponty's point about phenomenology, embodiments. We are embodied. We might think that we're screens, and we might think that we're heads, and you know, like everything goes through your brain. That's true. But at the same time, we are physically embodied. And I recently made a dance video. I know I know, I can't dance if my life depended on it. But the reason I made the dance video was I wanted to explore what embodied actually means, right? What does it mean for someone like, I'm a terrible dancer, so don't have high expectations if you ever see this video. I'm really not a good dancer. But that wasn't the point, right? The point was to be physically embodied and to express something, which is what dance is. This is expressive dance, right? To say something about that experience. So we experience the world through our bodies, even when we're looking at screens, we do that. And it's not something we can avoid. And this is crucial to the linguistic landscape. We are always embodied. Even when we're asleep at night, we are always embodied. We never escape our bodies. Well, I take that back. There might be a possibility of escaping, but I'm counting on it to be actually truthful. Okay, now let me tell you something about neuroscience. We all have a bias, and our bias is that we think we know what's going on in our bodies and around us. We think that we all believe, you all believe it. I think I believe it too, except that it's a technical impossibility for our bodies to do that. And the reason for this is very, very simple. We collect about 1 trillion bits of information a second through our sensory information in our body. Our brains are not programmed to do that. So we can process about 1 piece of information for every 1 billion pieces of information we get. That's a lot of missing information, right? Hopefully Elon Musk might be able to get hold of this information. That's my hope. But you know, we cannot process information. I developed a whole system of eliciting memories based on this principle. It is stored somewhere, but we're not aware of it. So there are ways of recreating it. Poetic autoethnography is a system to elicit memories and then turn them into images which are sensory, and then talk about those images. It's a process. But what I want to point out about this is we are not conscious of all the information coming from our surroundings which influences us. We're not aware of it. We're aware of certain things, but not of all the information. So let's talk about the interaction in the linguistic landscape. So we have a physical site. The physical site has multimodal sensory, semiotic, signage, all sorts of different types. Think of thunder and rain, but also think of signs themselves. Think of things that are more usually associated with language. We have a discourse, a historical discourse for every single thing that you are experiencing. These chairs have a history. They have a history of what a chair is. There's a long history of design that goes into these chairs. Every single thing you can think of has this discursive history. And then there's us. And we are embodied in this situation. And we experience it. At the same time, there's a piece that we're not aware of. In fact, there's lots of pieces we're not aware of that are going on all the time, both from the history of the discourse and also from our sensory information. So let me pose a basic hypothesis to you, and I'll read it to you. The majority of meanings, feelings, emotional states, and decisions are an unconscious response to the sensory messages we receive from our surroundings. At the most basic level, the study of the linguistic landscape is a study of the ways in which people read and write the environment and the psychological and discursive outcomes of these literacy practices. You want to sell a house? You want to sell a house? It's easy to sell a house. Make it really comfortable when somebody walks in. If it's cluttered and annoying, they ain't going to buy it. I have a dog. I have a dog with a lot of anxiety. My neighbor sold the house. I'm pretty sure my dog reduced the price of that house by about $30,000. I'm pretty sure, because every time someone walks by, my dog barks. She's scared of everything, but she's 60 pounds of muscle, and she looks super scary. She wouldn't bite you or do anything. But every time someone walks by, she's and I'm sure that people without knowing it think, I don't know if we want members neighbors. I'm sure it's translated into something very, very practical. Yeah, anyway, sorry. As I said, for me, things are not so easily differentiated between the academic. This is a study I love, actually. It's a really interesting study. If you own a supermarket, if you play French music, people will buy French wine. If you play German music, they will buy German wine. If you ask them, why did you buy French wine? They have no idea. They don't know. If you own a restaurant and you paint one wall blue, people who sit closer to that wall order more fish than people who sit on the other side of the restaurant and are not close to the blue wall. If you make crisps or chips, I think you would call them, more crunchy, sound more crunchy, people say they taste better. What is this? It's just like crazy. What, we're so stupid that we can be manipulated like this? But yes, we can. Of course we can. Because we cannot process all this information, so we just respond. Marketers know this. Marketers know this, which is one of the reasons why design has become such an important field in the late 20th century and falling into the 21st century. Okay, so now let's play a game a bit. Okay, let's see. We'll do it quickly because I don't know. I can speak for 8 hours until I fall over, of course. Let's just test this hypothesis. Imagine that you were. Can you see this? It's not a great picture. It's a shame. Anyway, never mind. Those of you at home can see it better, I think. Imagine you were sitting at the back of this wedding. Just think for a second how you would feel, and then think about what you are responding to. How you feel about weddings, how you feel about churches, how you feel about looking at a big cross, how you feel about the way these people are dressed, how you feel about the formality of it. How would you feel if you were sitting at the back? You don't have to tell me. This is not tell me your secrets sort of thing, but think about how you would feel in that space. And you'll see that there are a lot of points at which your personal positioning and the place that you are in are going to interact together. Yeah, perhaps if you turn, yeah, that's better. That's a much better picture. Now you can see the back wall, you can see, you get the feeling. Bear that in mind. Now, how about this? Let's say you're in the back of a rock concert. It's very loud. And, yeah, exactly. You've got it, obviously, been there. How would you feel in that situation? All the people shouting and there's lots of noise and things going on. Think about that. Think how you would respond to that place. And how about this one? This is a picture of a rally with people doing Heil Hitler. And don't say it wasn't Heil Hitler, because the semiotics of this hand movement are well documented and well known. So any BS about poetic interpretations of what this meant, Elon Musk or anybody else, thank you, but no. But think how you would feel under this situation. Notice the coloring they have for this particular picture. Okay, up until now, I guess I should speak into this. Up until now, I've been primarily speaking about the response to the linguistic landscape. Now I would like to talk about people who write the linguistic landscape and do it in relation to political activism. I could have chosen there's different ways in which people write the linguistic landscape. When you get an interior decorator for your house, you're writing the linguistic landscape. When you get a designer for billboards, you're writing the linguistic landscape. But I'd like to talk about political activism. And you'll see why in a second. So in true form, I'm going to quote myself. Sorry. What can I say? I do a lot of work in this area. But let me give you my version of this. The political protest involves a temporary recasting of the symbolic and representational meanings of the site of protest. So a demonstration or a protest is where you take a site and you want to cast it in a different light. You want to change its meaning. And the reason you want to change its meaning is because you want to make a particular political point or social point, let's say. And therefore, you do this in the public sphere. You do it in the environment. You work against a backdrop of a linguistic landscape which has messages in it. There's no environment which isn't deeply embedded in meanings that it's trying. There's no neutral space, right? Every space has its meanings that it is presenting. And when you protest in the space, really what you're trying to do is redefine the meaning of the site. And there's different ways of doing this, choosing location, through costumes, movement, dance, slogans, banners, leaflets. And this is just a limited list. There's many more things that can be done. So if you're studying this, what would you do? How would you create meaning here? Well, first of all, you need to think about the site itself. What is the site? You need to think about the sensations, what's in the site, the meanings, the historical meanings, and you also want to think about how it's discursively constructed. If you've ever had this experience of going abroad, or even going to a different part of America, it happened to me many times to go to different parts of America, you're kind of like lost. It's not that you don't know what to do, it's kind of like, it's not familiar to me, it's different for me. Some people see that as a very difficult experience. I feel like that nearly everywhere I go, so I embrace being an alien, I guess, one way or another. People matter. This is true for all my work, by the way. People matter. But people have identities, they have societal discourses, they have historical meanings, and they interpret and interact. So who the people are, where they're coming from, what they bring with them, what their identities are, how they interact, is obviously important. Language and imagery matters. We do use language. I've spoken a lot about the other semiotic signs, but we do use language. We use language to pin meanings. That's usually what we use language for, to pull it down to this is what I mean by this. And we use signs. And all these factors interact to create a meaning-laden linguistic landscape. So if you want to analyze from a linguistic landscape perspective, look at the site, look at the people, look at the signage of various sorts, and think about what is actually going on. So this is a very example from last month. It's still going on. People are standing outside Teslas, and they are redefining the Tesla. And they have been amazingly successful if you look at the stock price. Mm-hmm. Amazingly successful. So Tesla has gone from being an environmentally progressive company, providing environmentally friendly cars, to the swastika. And that is a big move, right? That is a very big distance to move. And Elon Musk has helped in this, but also these protests, the redefinition of these spaces has helped. And it does work. And I think this is an interesting example that we do have voice. No matter what side of the political framework you are on, we have voice. And we can express it, in America at least, in the public sphere. And we can redefine things, and we can point out things. Now, I want to do a slightly deeper discursive analysis. I'm not going to do a full linguistic landscape analysis, as I said. I don't think this is the right forum. But I do want to give sort of a sense of not just the Musk example, which I think is a pretty shallow example in the sense of a response. I want to do one that is slightly deeper than that has a very different type of historical orientation, which, as you'll see, speaks to me personally. So we're going to do a deeper discursive case study of Never Again, and in particular, a Jewish group, a Jewish action group called Never Again Action, and they're still active today, although the example I'm going to give is historical. So Never Again Action is a Jewish social protest movement, and they're primarily interested in migration, supporting migrants in various different ways and objecting to xenophobic migration policies. So on August 8th, 2019, they blocked the entrances of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement headquarters in Seattle to disrupt its operation. This was a 45-minute protest. And you can see them here. Never Again is now. Please notice the colors, the yellow and the black. I'll come back to that. And please notice that they're standing, holding hands, and stopping people from going in and coming out of the ICE center. Now, you might think that they invented the Never Again, but Never Again is actually situated in one of the first linguistic landscape usages that we actually are aware of. So in Buchenwald concentration camp, Jewish survivors who left that camp put up signs, multilingual signs, saying Never Again. It's not a well-known fact that they use the linguistic landscape, but clearly they used handwritten signs, and it was, we're talking about desperate people under very difficult circumstances who thought it was important to write their message on the environment in the concentration camp after they were freed by American soldiers in 1945. So the term Never Again has a very particular history within the linguistic landscape framework and within Jewish consciousness, I would say. So Never Again is an imperative situated within a Jewish consciousness of the atrocity of the Holocaust and the possibility that such horrors of human action have happened and can happen again to a range of ethnic, racial, and religious groups. It's not limited to anti-Semitism and the outcomes of anti-Semitism. It is a basic Jewish consciousness, or should be, I should say, basic Jewish consciousness about atrocity. Now, I'd like to look a little bit at the signage that was used here, and I think a lot of it is quite interesting. Never Again is now was the term they used, and they turned out. In other words, bringing that historical consciousness into action. We're talking about 2019. If you remember that period, there were so-called, I don't know what they call them, camps where they put kids in cages and things. The aim of this political activism was to draw attention exactly to that sort of framework. So one way they did it, and this is a really, I hope you can see, if you look at the picture at the back, you'll see that we have faces with an ethnic identity, which is not Jewish, I think, and Stars of David, which is very Jewish, the signing of people, the marking of people in the same way. And then we also have these images of these flowery, family, positive immigrant families. And I think the basic attempt here, the message here was, what are you doing? These are basic people, positive people. We're not talking about rapists and murderers and what have you. And you're treating them just like Jews were treated in the Holocaust, as if they're criminals and murderers and some illness that needs to be dealt with. So it's a movement, so it's a redefining of the migration policy and its action in terms of the historical precedent of the Holocaust. That's what we have in this movement. We see it here also, the term concentration camps for kids. I don't think they were concentration camps. I don't think I would carry the analogy that far, but they were camps, they were horrible, and you don't have to gas people to death for it to be an atrocity, I think. And the attempt here, once again, was very focused to describe those camps in this way and to argue for defunding. The demonstration lasted for 45 minutes. No one was arrested, I don't think, at this particular. They stopped ICE for a few hours, about 4 hours, 5 hours. I don't know if this changed the policy or not, probably not. But at least it didn't let it get away with the neutrality of the policy, the procedural bureaucratic nature of the policy. Remember that most evil, Holocaust as well, was performed by bureaucrats. We always think of evil and the performance of evil as an act of a sadist monster. And there are some of those as well. I'm not discounting humans' ability to be sadistic. But the vast majority is just bureaucracy, just people doing their job, so to speak. So I don't know if this was a successful demonstration or not. But I do know that it didn't leave the discursive space empty with just neutral bureaucratic statements. I'm not going to analyze this one, but I do want to speak about it quickly. So this sign, Nie wieder, is German for never again. And this is a sign that it's an encampment, I should say, a Free Palestine encampment in the University of Aachen. And I want you to think for a second what it means that German students come out and say never again in relation to what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in Palestine. I want you to think about it. I'm not going to analyze it deeply for all sorts of reasons at the moment, but I think you're all clever enough, learned enough to work it out for yourselves. What they are bringing into this conversation, what they are applying to this conversation about what's happening in Palestine and Gaza. And I'd like to leave you with this final thought. It's not so much about the linguistic landscape, I guess. It's just where I am as a human being. And it comes from Elie Wiesel, who was a Holocaust survivor, wrote several books. You probably know a few of them. And if you don't, you should go out and read them. I highly recommend them. They're short on the whole, but I'd like to read you this thought. Never again becomes more than a slogan. It's a prayer, a promise, a vow. There will never again be hatred. Oops. There'll never again jail and torture, never again the suffering of innocent people or the shooting of starving, frightened, terrified children. And never again the glorification of base, ugly, dark violence. It's a prayer. It's my prayer, I should say. So thank you for listening. Questions and comments. This is Gaza in March 2025. And if you're not horrified, I don't know what to say, I guess. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. I personally am absolutely horrified for the reasons presented in that last prayer. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions if you have any, or answer things that came up. And done. Well, how long did that take?
Also to moderate questions for us. To anyone that's on Zoom, I'm going to put into the chat too. Zoom questions need to come in the chat, and we'll read them out into the room.
Technology is definitely not my That's the problem when we talk about the Holocaust, it shuts everybody up. And
people here know a lot more. Yeah. And one thing I thought would be interesting to do as an experiment.
Use the microphone. We were having people come up and use the microphone yesterday so that the audience can hear us. They yeah.
And move this out of the bit.
First of all, I'd just like to say thanks. It's so great to see you. It really is. This is somebody who has been just a huge influence on me and on the literature and criticism program. I mean, I don't think it's too much to say that a lot of the work we do in the literature and criticism program has been inspired by you. The conversation we had many years ago about teaching poetry. How do you teach language? Translate poetry. We're still doing that. So I really wanted to thank you for coming, and it's just such a pleasure and so moving to hear you. It's a fabulous presentation. I'd like to kind of, because I think people have a context. Some people here have a context that can start to move us from your initial example across history. So I was wondering if anybody had any questions related to, for example, signs, or the book of the sign, the Sefer Ha'ot, or the book of creation, the Sefer Yetzirah, or some of the things that we've been doing in some classes where we're looking at that moment of intervention that you talk about first and see how it travels into the Middle Ages. So that sign becomes the subject of a poem, but also becomes a mode by which the world is built. The world is created out of letters in this strange Kabbalistic world. And so I was wondering if anybody had any, before I ask a question, does anybody have any questions? I know many of you are very interested in that. I thought you might. No. I'm going to. I'm just going to hand this over to you. Sit down.
I guess my question is rooted in the early inscriptions that you were talking about from, what was it, the Merneptah stele, or one of the early Egyptian artifacts we have that document it. That's written in a particular language that is picture-based, right? The Egyptian hieroglyphs. I could go on about how, that turned into the Hebrew alphabet, to the Phoenician alphabet, but is there anything significant that you found in maybe the historical context of documenting that moment in history through a language that is based pictures, as opposed to the more abstract language that we use today?
So I think I would say ironically, I would answer this question like Donald Trump. I'm going to talk about something else. One of the things that interests me a lot, and often shocks me, actually, is there's a whole translation problem when we're talking about ancient texts. So a mistake by a scribe can turn into a whole canon of work, which is based on basically a translation mistake. That doesn't discount it, because I think there's things. So it's problematic, of course, whenever you do any translation, visual or otherwise. The example, the people I spoke of, there's only a very limited number of references to them. The name, we're not sure if Shusha is a people or a land. So it might be the people of Shusha, or it might be the Shusha as a people. It's not 100% sure which we're talking about. And there is a problem with the form, actually in the visual hieroglyph, which makes this more confusing, whether it is a land or a people. We assume, biblical scholars who are far better at this than I am, assume that the word means wanderers, so we assume they're nomadic, and actually the inscription is about them being destroyed. so, you know, Yahweh had a great history. His beginnings weren't so great. He seemed to lose a lot because the two inscriptions we have, he lost battles, basically, and got destroyed. Yeah, but I think the point you're raising is there is an issue with translation. It always kills me when someone says to me, it's written in the Bible and they're reading it in English. That kills me. Like, I'm thinking, what? You don't know what's written there. You're telling me you know what's written there? You don't know what's written there. You know what some English bloke thought that was written there. And they had a committee, great. They had a committee. I like committees, but we've all been in committees and we know what happens in committees. What happens in committees, we reduce it to the norm, like what everybody agrees upon. And that might be the guy over there who had this individual interpretation, perhaps he was right. So, yeah, so thanks for the question. I think it's a problem translation.
I do have, I see one more question from the audience. I have one quick note from Dr. Gloria Park in here as well. Thank you, Dr. Hanauer, for this very thought-provoking lecture. I'm still processing your powerful presentation. You truly helped me to understand in such a short time how interdisciplinarity linguistic landscape is. And she's also curious, it's a preview of the course to come in the fall as well.
Yeah. So I do have a course coming in the fall on linguistic landscape. For those of you who are finishing your studies, I teach online. It's difficult for me to, this is very unusual. I honestly do not usually leave my house. So for those of you who can't join the Zoom class, I always produce on YouTube a self-study version of the course. You can just go on, I'll ask Rachel to share when it's ready. You can just go on and do the course yourself. You get to see me speaking and doing stuff that I do, digressing as well. I'm a bit more, say, controlled when I do PowerPoint stuff online, but still I digress all the time. So yeah, it is a preview. The difference is that in the course, all my courses are what I developed in the sciences, actually course-based research experiences. They're all, you use this knowledge to do a study, and that course is the same. And there's a much bigger focus on methodology, which I don't think is particularly appropriate here. You're all welcome. Please join the course to do the online version.
Thank you, Dr. Hanauer. I apologize if this answer is obvious, but this is my introduction to research into linguistic landscape. And so it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that this is really applied to a lot of print media, like posters and like what we see in the physical space. But can this research apply to the digital space as well?
So the answer is yes, and actually there's a group which does uses the linguistic landscape for digital studies. If you're interested, afterwards just send me an email and I'll direct you to some studies. The answer is yes. I personally, though, because I'm so analog, I guess, I have a slight problem with it because I always think the digital is a double space. There's the screen, whatever is on the screen, and then there's where you are and the physical space you are in. And I often find that they take the digital space and ignore the physical space. And my tendency is to think that is problematic. But I understand the importance of digital space. The mere fact I don't particularly like it myself that's just an age thing, right? It's neither here nor there. But yes, there is a group which deals with it. It's very popular, and I'll be happy to put you in contact with them. So I can give you references, but I can also introduce you to the people themselves if that's something that you're following now.
Okay, Dr. Hanauer, I have a question going back to kind of the first third of your lecture. You were talking about how we respond to signs in the environment while also creating signs. And I was thinking about that creative element and the intentionality behind it. And how would you see the balance between performativity, authenticity, values clarification, signaling? Like, where do all of those overlap or differentiate for you?
Okay, so this is going to sound strange. So, but first off, I think human beings are not coherent. They're not coherent in themselves, and I don't think it's possible to actually be coherent to yourself. So, at different times, there are different pieces which come into play. I decided to wear a tie, right? I don't always wear a tie. Sometimes I wear a tie. But I decided to wear a tie. Why? Because I respect the setting. I want to show that I respect the setting. And so I'm wearing the tie. Now, I think the authenticity piece and its connection to the performative piece is a question of how much work you actually do on yourself to understand the performances you're actually making. So we're all required to, that's what society is about, right? We're all required to relate to and perform in certain ways. But there are performances which are, for lack of a better term, we'll say unexamined, and then there are performances which are examined. And I think the more examined they are, the more authentic they become. But I don't fault anybody for doing very performative things. I don't necessarily see it as inauthentic. I might see it as experimentation. And I think we need to be very forgiving for a whole lot of things that people do, including performances and even some acting out, I think. Depends who and what power they have. I don't forgive Musk for his acting out because he's enormously powerful. But I might forgive a lot of other people. Does that help? Basically, what I think is that every human being should do an autoethnography. So that's really what I think. And if they do an autoethnography, they'll have a better examination of, and probably they should do 3 or 4 throughout their lives, and then there's a better examination of who they are. And then the performances they make, I think, are more attuned to where they are. But we are not coherent. And I think it's a mistake to think that people are coherent. And I don't, you know, if someone you know, people, because I have a strange accent, people often ask me, where are you from? And I tend to answer, well, it depends which part of my life we're talking about, or when in my life we're talking about. Because I've lived in a lot of different places, so it depends. So perhaps, or my daughter, I often tell the story, my daughter speaks 5 languages, and she's far happier in Italian than she is in German or Dutch, or English for that matter. In Italian, she's happy. She's like a different person.
Actually have one question as well. I'm thinking of yesterday's keynote was talking about maps in particular. So I'm thinking of the very heavy-handed approach to linguistic landscape applied in maps. In many cases, we have these defined borders that have coexisted with each other long enough they've become solidified. But I'm thinking, for instance, post World War I, or after the British leave the Middle East and they're carving up the Middle East along lines on a map that they're defining India and Pakistan, or zeroing in on Palestine and the examples we were just sharing now, where you have overlapping linguistic landscapes and these languages of power that kind of come from there. As I say this, I realize that maybe that's not a direct question so much as a pondering, which is in keeping. But it is interesting how this idea of a linguistic landscape, how does that relate to cartography and like these choices that we make, the psychology of mapping, the psychology of geography you had spoken about before?
So I think it's a great question. I think it captures exactly what the linguistic landscape is about. Why do we create maps? We create maps so that we can make the land be a sign. And then we take that sign so seriously. Like, it's so ridiculous. We take it so seriously that it completely defines everything. So maps are the ultimate human signage of space. Now, having said that, there's a deep history here. And I said it before a bit about the Shusha people. You know, in ancient times, a temple was not symbolic as a house of God. It was the house where God lived. And the land upon which that house was sacred ground. So that's a level of signage over space which is very deep. And I think a lot of that has carried through. And in the 19th century, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, you see that translated internationally. And you see the excesses of that definition. But the truth is, you know, we have land is land, doesn't belong to anyone. I mean, we make it belong through leases and documents and so on. We sign it, but the land is the land. But human beings need to do that signage. That's why I started with the example I started. We need to feel that, because otherwise we face chaos. We're open to powers which are beyond us. We are all fragile and scared and small. And we use these systems of signage to give ourselves a sense of security, safety, and space. So it's a good question. I know I didn't answer it exactly, but still, it's a good question.
Anyone else?
So you talked about the bits of information which we kind of lose in that, and you talked a little bit about the idea of recovering those bits. And then you also mentioned autoethnography. biography, so I'm just kind of curious more about that, if you could kind of go into it.
This is my favorite topic. Next to God is my favorite topic. Yeah, so I can answer this in one word: free writing. So if you want to know the psycholinguistics of this, I'll be happy to send you papers on psycholinguistics. If you want to know the technicalities of the methodology, you should go to my YouTube channel, and I'll ask you. Rachel can probably share it with you, anybody who has it anyway. But now let me answer your question. So when you do free associative writing, really do free associative writing, you're not in control of the information that's being elicited. So if I ask you to think about a significant moment in your life and to free write about it, and then to continue to free write about it, and then I ask you to read what you wrote, you will see that you produce information which you didn't even know you had. It would be shocking to you what you find out about yourself. And that's why I say people aren't coherent in the first place. We don't even know what we know about the things that happen to us, let alone about a whole lot of other things. So the methodology is, if you can create a space where there's this free generative language production relating to your own memories, you're going to produce memories, you're going to elicit, you're going to translate some of your stored sensory information into language which you can then analyze. Does that help? But you shouldn't believe me, you should try it. You should just try it, just free write. Take 15 minutes this evening, tomorrow, the day after, think about significant event, just free write about it, and then afterwards read it and see what comes up, and hopefully that will help.
Also, I was thinking merge dream analysis into it.
Yeah. I have it's not, if you don't know, I was diagnosed with cancer, and I was given, I was in a panic. I had a panic attack. It's not unusual. So I was sent to a center, and at this center, they thought about which psychologist they should give me. And they thought about cognitive behavior therapy, counseling, all that. And then they saw my notebook, and they said, no, none of this is going to work. You're far too clever for this. It's not going to work. You'll see through it. You're an applied linguist. You'll see that. And then they decided to give me a psychoanalyst. And I thought, wow, this is such a weird thing to do. And this psychoanalyst doesn't give a damn about what's happening in my life. What she cares about is dreams and cycles. And it's the best thing that ever happened to me in my life. So, yes, you're right.
Sure, you could voice this for me. There is the space that you were talking about earlier, for that kind of discovery of writing has been actually created by Mara and Adriana in the creative mix, which will follow this panel. I'm not sure what time. What time is the creative?
Right.
It's actually our next. It's the next.
It's the next thing. What a lovely transition.
In other words, for those who could not hear that, stick around for the next session on creativity. We're going to begin delving more into the exact principles that we were just touching on. So, any other announcements? Here we go.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Hanauer, for your lecture and all of the novel ideas that you gave us to consider. I will see you in the fall.